Okay, thank you all for getting here on our side event of the Pantarey Foundation. My name is Michał Specjalski. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Council of Founders for the Pantarey Foundation, which is a Polish-based, Warsaw-based NGO working in public diplomacy and human rights. And today we're going to have Excuse me. Okay, now it's working. Please don't. Okay, so once more. From the Volhynian Crime and history lesson Poland to Bucza and other crimes scenes against civilians in Ukraine, historical and international legal aspects of the committed crimes against civilians. So our guest today is Professor Włodzimierz Osadczy, Professor of Humanities and a Polish historian of Ukrainian origin. And he's gonna give you a brief introduction to the crime that was committed 8 years ago, mostly on Polish nationalities, also Jews and Ruthenians, by the Ukrainian nationalists. And then we're gonna have Wiesław Goździewicz, Lieutenant Commander, a legal counselor of NATO Joint Force Training Center in Bydgoszcz. And he's gonna give us introduction how the international humanitarian law and human rights law changed from this time, because we know that the humanitarian law and human rights law regarding security for the civilians came afterwards. So came after the Holocaust, of course, came after different genocides that didn't have a legal framework to be convicted. And the first speaker would be Christian Zeitz from the Wiener Akademikerbund, and he's gonna he's running 30 kilometers from Vienna campus for refugees from Ukraine. So he's gonna bring some the insights from the modern violations that he personally knows from those refugees. But he also gonna speak about kind of more generalization, how we can secure in the future more civilians in the international conflicts. So not further ado, we're gonna start the presentation with Professor Włodzimierz Osadczy with an introduction to the Volhynian Massacre, that maybe not all are aware that there were this kind of violations before. So the floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much. The name of my topic is Genocidum Atrox, barbarity in the name.
You speak forward.
Barbarity in the name of the nation, the genocide by the Ukrainian nationalists during World War II. ESPAT, Genocidium Atrox. On 22 July 2016, the same Parliament of the Republic of Poland adopted a resolution introducing into political circulation the concept of genocide in relation to crimes of Ukrainian nationalists against the civilian population living in the eastern borderland of the Second Polish Republic. Genocide crimes were defined even earlier by the Polish justice system, when investigating the crime of Ukrainian nationalists under Article 118 of the Criminal Code. Acts classified as genocide consist in the murder or infliction of permanent injury on a group of people defined by the criteria of nationality, race, religion, worldview, ethnicity, or political beliefs. Due to the exception cruelty in carrying out genocidal practice, the term Genocidium Atrox, a Latin expression denoting a cruel and savage act, was introduced into the Polish literature. The term was first used by Polish professor Ryszard Szablowski, who stressed that the Ukrainian genocide was different from the German and Soviet crimes in that it involved infliction physical, mental, and moral torture on the victims. The crime is characterized as follows. First, the extermination of the entire Polish population took place immediately at a given time, at a given locality, and affect the entire Polish population from infants to the elderly. The victims were left with no hope to rescue. Second, the genocide was combined with the use of the most cruel torture deriving from the 16th and 18th century tradition of Cossack and Haidamaks. The methods included chopping victims with axes, throwing the wounded into wells, dragging them on horseback, gouging out their eyes, pulling out their tongues, and so on. The Germans, or even the Soviets as well, did not carry out such barbaric acts. While the German and Soviet genocides were carried out exclusively by specialized criminal uniformed formation, the situation was different with the genocides of Ukrainian nationalists. The majority of the perpetrators belonged to Bandera's Ukrainian insurgent army, especially when it came to the larger genocidal actions. But tens of thousands of local Ukrainian peasants, neighbors, gangs also took part, armed with axes, pitchforks, etc. They were sometimes accompanied by women, adolescents, and even Ukrainian children who busied themselves with indiscriminating looting as property, and the killing of wounded Poles. Fourth, the murders were carried out in mixed marriage. Ukrainian family members were forced to murder their Polish spouse with their own hands. Five, the murders were not committed by foreign occupation, but by fellow citizens of the same country, residents of the Second Polish Republic. Six, the Ukrainian state and society have never held the criminals accountable of condemned the crimes. Thus far, Ukraine has been following a strategy of keeping silent and sometimes even falsifying the facts about the genocide committed by the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and Ukrainian Insurgent Army. Purpose. By committing the crime of genocide, its initiation were carrying out the program of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists to exterminate Polish inhabitants from areas they considered to be Ukrainian. These two traditions of independence and with no tradition to independence and no positive models of state building, Ukrainian nationalists operated of slogans blaming the Polish and Russian nation states for not having their own state. In Volhynia and Eastern Lesser Poland, the former Eastern Galicia, the blade and hatred was directed at the Poles and the anti-Polish attitude was exacerbated by the bitterness of losing the Polish-Ukrainian war. Ukrainian nationalists included Moskals, a pejorative term of Russians, Jews, and Poles among their historical enemies, but treated the last group with particular hatred. National enmity aside, there was also a civilizational divide at stake. The nationalist ideologies saw Latin urban culture as a symbol of foreign occupation in Ukrainian land, while the Russians, as belonging to the same circle of civilization, could be left alone. All Poles had to be displaced because of the popular perception of Western countries. Murder of who refused to leave, wrote Michał Specjalski, an ideologue of Ukrainian nationalism. He was aware that the murder of the 3.5 million Jews and 1 million Poles was a difficult task to accomplish. Hence, he recommended maintaining an atmosphere of terror and constant threat. The theoretical assumption of the nationalist ideologies start to spread among the Ukrainian population, convincing them that it was necessary to get rid of the Poles. In February 1943, at the Third Congress of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, it was decided that all occupants, civilian inhabitants of non-Ukrainian origin, should be removed, starting with individual murders in Polish family. In 1943, the Ukrainian nationalists progressed to well-organized actions, consistently attacking individual districts in Volhynia. The nationalists murdered approximately 60,000 Poles in at least 80-90 towns and villages. The same happens again in 1944 in eastern Lesser Poland, when at least 35,000 Poles were murdered. The perpetrators wanted all tracts of Polish presence to be removed in the area that we were to become part of the future Ukrainian state. Architectural and ecclesiastical monuments that testified to the enemy's ownership and reinforced his strength were not to be demolished. Catholic Church was destroyed in the first place. The nationalists led to liquidation about 70% of parishes. All village churches were ruined and devastated. Their liturgical equipment, vestments, and archives destroyed. Any trace of the Polish was to be erased forever. Irrational barbarity. Witnesses and researchers emphasize the particular cruelty and sadistic enjoyment of inflicting pain on their victims that was unprecedented in the 20th century in Europe. Thousands of testimonies collected from survivors of the massacre recounted horrific image of people being slaughtered with the most atrocious methods. The ethnic cleansing, which was based on some kind of criminal logic and designed to ensure the future security of the totalitarian state, turned into satanic celebration of evil. When learning about the details of the Volhynian Massacre, this is the term that had become commonplace because of the killing method used. Modern people ask the same questions again and again. Why so? The mystery behind the Volhynian Galicia massacre is why the Ukrainians did not murder in a regular way. Why did they not just kill their victims? Did they have no torture them? Perhaps the sadistic desires were triggered by the very shapes of the tools. The arc of the site, the curved tightness of the pitchfork, the long row of the even so tins may have prompted an endless string of possibilities to imagination. This from a bullet is like mass production, while this inflicted by the Bandera people were handmade, unlike any other, reflects Katarzyna Surmiak-Domańska, described the fate of her family during war. A total of 136 methods of murdering when women, children of Polish nationality, as well as Ukrainian, who did not agree with the policy of nationalists, have been identified from the documented evidence of torture, including in various research work. The fate of the 30-year-old woman from Antonówka in Volhynia, who was returning from church, is described. Quote, she was pregnant. The Bandera people attacked her on the road. They made it a full day's walk. They were in no hurry. They were testing how long the agony could be prolonged. First, they cut off her fingers one by one. Then they cut off her toes. Then the breasts and the tongue. Before the victims choked on her own blood, they flayed her. The scream was heard within a kilometer. End of quote. A miraculous survivor of the massacre, Mrs. Janina Kalinowska, whom the author was lucky enough to meet, lost consciousness during the massacre of her family and was assumed dead by the Ukrainians, nationalists. She thanked God that her parents and brother had been shot. At least it was quick death, she says. Other Poles from the Volhynia were not so lucky. The Ukrainian nationalists mutilated them with agricultural tools, chopped them up with axes and horribly abused before actually proceeding to the killing. What remained in the memory of the survivors was the image of the irrational savagery of the perpetrators, for whom the inflicting of pain and death in the name of an independent Ukrainian was a source of perverted sadistic pleasure. Coaches, the Ukrainians from the guns had one thing is common. They didn't only want to kill, but to torment. They didn't just want to ask a person to die, they wanted them to be in terrible pain before this. That was a strange thing about them. End of quote. Sources. The sources of this attitude is to be found in the ideological and cultural condition. The ideology of Ukrainian nationalism was based on the totalitarian models from the first half of the 20th century. It was described as a primitive variant of fascism or Nazism. This ideology was aimed at the emancipation peasantry and created a fantastic vision of the states that never exist. That lack of statehood was explained by so-called foreign occupation. Hence, the critique of the state was the destruction of the occupies. This is why the destruction of the Polish identity in the eastern borderlands was charged with such monstrous emotions, with viciousness root in the deep psychological feeling of inferiority. The viciousness stemmed from the country's old social resentment of the peasants, mass seeing the Poles as an embodiment of the civil and civilization values they never possessed. For many centuries, the relaxation of discipline caused by the waking of the Polish state had provoked wild peasant and Cossack revolts, which were a prelude to the genocide during World War II. The ideology offered to the nationalist gangs was profoundly anti-Christian, much like communism or Nazism. Composite in neo-pagan spirit, the Decalogue of Ukrainian nationalists called for committing the worst crime for the sake of the national cause. An ideological system was created to justify barbarity for the higher purpose. Ukrainian Greek Catholic Bishop Gregory Homician describes this ideology as a worst heresy that afflicted his people. He viewed it as having satanic qualities. Dehumanization of society. Like Nazism and communism, Ukrainian nationalism led to a profound civilizational ruin in territories that had been influenced by Eastern and Western Christianity. The centuries-old tradition of peaceful coexistence between different people and religions, the unparalleled harmony that had developed on the eastern borderland of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was ruined. The Polish nation suffered unbelievable trauma and extreme pain during World War II. One of the greatest Polish philosophers of the modern time, the long-time rector of the Catholic University in Lublin, Dominican Mieczysław Albert Krąpiec, claimed that one can hardly find such an accumulation of monstrous crime in the history of mankind. He knew very well what he was talking about, as he came from the village that had been affected by the Ukrainian genocide. The perpetrators also suffered huge losses. By carrying out barbaric slaughters, they brought eternal disgrace upon themselves and their families, dishonoring the idea of Ukrainian state. They were responsible for the immense tragedies experienced by Ukrainian families. Killings of spouses of Polish nationality were common practice. In some mixed families, sons born of Polish mother even resort to matricide. Having experienced such a cruel reality, the society is now burdened by a mourners crime and condemned to years of failure. Inferiors victims, despite a comprehensive body of evidence demonstrating the crimes of Ukrainian nationalists, they have not been duly condemned in Poland, and the victims have not been properly commemorated. A Polish priest of Armenian origin, Tadeusz Isakowicz-Zaleski, described this state as a double murder of the inhabitants of the borderland. The first time with the acts of the nationalist, and second time with oblivion. This is distated by ill-conceived geopolitical calculation, which can be seen particularly clearly in the current state of affairs. Ukraine has not made any attempt of condemn of the criminal ideology of committed acts. Modern Ukrainian statehood is built on nationalism. The genocide is being negated. Hundreds of thousands of remains of murdered Poles have not yet been exhumed and given a Christian burial. Monuments are erected to the ideologies and perpetrators of genocide who are venerated as national heroes. How apt the observation of the great Polish writer Kornel Makuszyński made over 100 years ago, at the time when similar acts were taking place in Eastern Ukraine after the Bolshevik Revolution. Perhaps the time will yet come when this man, too, the madman who slaughtered a man with a soul and repeat children, will suddenly stand numb from fear before the hideous sight of this deed, and the human vision will speak up. Every madness terribly agitate passes, and so will this one. In his spiritual poverty and dying of hunger in the most fertile land in the world, the savage man from the Ukrainian steppe will perhaps understand with incredible difficulty that he has done something terrible, that with his bloody hands he has killed the soul of his land, tormenting people and animals, defilling the earth and wounding the trees. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Osadczy, that you give us the lecture of forgotten genocide, kind of a pre-legal genocide, because the the treaty that is condemning genocide, of course, it was written of course, later after the war, and those atrocities were happening between 1939 and 1947. Most of them, they were convicted in 1943 and 1944. So a Polish lawyer, Rafał Lemkin, that he was a Jewish descendant, created the definition of genocide afterwards, of course, and he was using the situation with Ormanians killed by Turks, of course, and also Jews killed by Petluras, so the former insurgent groups in Ukraine, and this group at the time, these crimes at the time wasn't really known. So this was the problem. But so now we're going to shift from this. We are saying this because it's 8 years from this forgotten pre-genocide activities in Galicia. And we now going to go to Wiesław Goździewicz, but before we're going to do it, I would like to show some pictures. So if somebody is, there's going to be some cruel pictures. So if somebody want to see it, please, you can go now, because I must show them so that you're going to know what we are talking about. Because I think some of you could be the first time that you are hearing about this genocide. So please, I'm gonna present you like a small portion of pictures from the slaughter. That was one of the biggest slaughters in the Galicia and in Central Europe. So in Poland is rzeź wołyńska, so slaughter, because it was, like I said before, the legal definitions of genocide. And you can see that this is the borders of pre-war Poland, and on the picture you can see what regions were of course the Poland was under occupation, German occupation in this time. So you can see which region was between now it's of course Ukraine. This is only in the picture, but you can emotionally go into the emotions, how it was happening, because it was, like the professor said, a slaughter between basically neighbors. So they know those people that killed them. And this is the pictures. I'm gonna show you some pictures from original pictures. This is original pictures from the happening. So I'm gonna click them, and with silence, let's watch them. So, for those who don't know this topic, please Google Zbrodnia Wolyńska, which is the best term to use to check it in online, because if you're going to check the Volhynian Massacre, you can see all those things. And there is also a movie, the Volhynia movie. You can search, and there is a movie that you can watch, commercial movie, but regarding those issues. And you can check also two sites, which is public sites in Poland, zbrodniawolyńska.pl or volhynianmassacre.eu. Please also check the Polish one, because on Polish one you can see also the animation of the regions and all those places. And our project is the stopantypolonism.pl, which you can watch all those projects that we are running this year. The last thing I can show you, this is the president of Poland, Andrzej Duda, that was commemorating those victims in 2000. On 2000, I think, which on the 75th anniversary, because today is so 5 years ago. Why he's kneeling on the land, and because there is no cemetery in Ukraine that can celebrate those victims. This is the only sculpture in Poland which is created, but it's also because of of course, the war on Ukraine and Polish-Ukrainian relations by the public institutions are not financed. And this is Professor Osadczy is one of the people that are involved in setting this sculpture that is going to be set this year, I think, yes, in July, because the time of this massacre was 8 years ago in July. So, not further ado, let's go to Wiesław Goździewicz, because we don't have so much time. And Mr. Goździewicz, he's gonna go out from this specific genocide of Poles, Jews and Ruthenians, so pre-Ukrainians, and show a more universal picture of legal framework that from those times, from 8 years ago, was introduced. So, Mr. Wiesław Goździewicz, could you join us and please present your thing?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, thank you for the opportunity of to be able to speak to you today. So, my specialty is definitely not international criminal law. My specialty is international humanitarian law, or the law of armed conflict, and this is what I would like to present to you today. So I don't know if you can see the presentation already or not, but the topic of the presentation is the evolution of the law of armed conflict, also known as the international humanitarian law in the area of protection of civilians. So if you can flip the slides for me, I would be grateful. And if we could move to the second slide.
I think you must share your screen, Colonel.
Oh, in that case, please give me a second. It will take a moment.
Okay. So, so we showed the massacre, of course, because this is the anniversary, and for us Poles is important, of course. But so it's one of the genocide, pre-genocide legal definition that is not well known internationally. That's why we like to show it. But of course, we are showing this as a start to speak about what was done from these times, from the Second World War, in the international legal framework, in international humanitarian law, but also, of course, human rights law. And then we're going to move to modern times, if we're going to manage the time, to speak what experience and what knowledge we can get from it, and how to secure the civilians with armed conflicts and also war, like non-international conflicts that Volhynia was. Because in Volhynia we had, of course, civilians, we had Ukrainian insurgency. The state was, these regions were already occupied by the Germans, so there wasn't any or there was less soldiers of course Poland that could help those civilians. Yes. Are you ready?
Yes, I am. Apologies for the little delay. Now let me try and share the screen with you, if that's possible.
Is it possible, or maybe we can skip the presentation? You can.
Okay, so apologies. I'm trying to share it, but it's a browser-based application, which is not enabling.
Okay,
me
just
to,
let's just skip it. We're gonna
So
present.
okay, ladies and gentlemen. So basically, the first attempt to regulate the the protection of civilians under the international humanitarian law was the 1907 Hague Convention 4, which dealt with the laws and customs of land warfare. And the convention itself actually contained a handful, a little more than a handful, 6 articles that dealt with the conduct of warfare from the perspective of protection of civilians. Article 25 of the so-called Hague regulations prohibited the attacks or bombardments against towns, villages, or dwellings which are undefended. Article 27 stated that in sieges and bombardments, all necessary steps must be taken to spare, as far as possible, buildings dedicated to religion, art, science, or charitable purposes. Article 28 prohibited the pillage of a town or place, even taken by assault. Then Article 50 prohibited the application of general penalty, pecuniary or otherwise, upon the population on account of the acts of individuals of which they cannot be regarded as jointly and severally responsible. So basically the prohibition of collective punishment. Article 46, which required the parties to the conflict to respect the family honor and rights, the lives of persons and private property, as well as religious convictions and practice. And stated that private property cannot be confiscated. Article 56, which provided for the protection of property of municipalities that are of institutions dedicated to religion, charity, and education, the arts of science, even if state property, that should be treated as private property. It means protected from seizure or confiscation. All seizure or destruction or willful damage done to institutions of religious, educational, charity, etc. character should be made subject of legal proceedings. Now, the Hague Conventions regulated the conduct of warfare. So they contained the rules which those who conducted warfare, who were involved in hostilities, should follow, should abide by. And this has proven to be insufficient in reflection of the atrocities committed by the armed forces of the Axis, and not only the Axis, to be honest, during the Second World War, because it is safe to say that the Allied forces have committed numerous atrocities and war crimes against the civilian populace in the occupied or so-called liberated areas on both Western and Eastern Front. And we've all probably been more familiar with the atrocities committed by the Soviet Army in the East Front. Nevertheless, there have been numerous cases of atrocities against civilians or prisoners of war committed by Allied forces also on the Western Front. And I'm not going to spend much time on this topic, but this is just to give you the background of where the 4 Geneva Conventions dating 1949 came from. And this is actually where we're starting to talk about international humanitarian law in the sense of protecting the victims of armed conflicts, as opposed to the Hague branch, which regulated the conduct of hostilities. The Geneva branch, formed by the 4 conventions dated 1949, been dedicated to the protection of the victims of armed conflicts. First Geneva Convention dealt with the wounded and sick in the armies or the land forces of the parties to the conflict. Second Geneva Convention dealt with the wounded, sick, and shipwrecked. So basically in the navies of the states parties to the conflict. Third Geneva Convention dealt with the protection granted to prisoners of war. But from our perspective, and given the topic of this panel, the most important one is the 4th Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war. So the 4th Geneva Convention actually is the most important instrument of international humanitarian law dealing with the protection of civilians in times of international armed conflicts, because all the 4 Geneva Conventions generally apply only in times of international, so state-on-state armed conflicts. And there's only a handful of provisions like common articles 2 and 3 of all the Geneva Conventions that are equally applicable to non-international armed conflicts. But the whole Geneva Convention 4 is dedicated to protecting civilians in times of armed conflict. And it's not just a handful of articles. It's the whole treaty dedicated exclusively to protecting civilians. And it includes provisions on internment, provision of food and clothing, hygiene and medical detention, religious, intellectual, and physical activities, penal and disciplinary sanctions, transfers of internees, etc., etc. But most importantly, the Geneva Convention 4 states that civilians who do not take part in hostilities need to be protected from any acts of violence, including sexual violence. Those civilians who do not take part in hostilities, so those who are not actively engaged in war fighting activities, are entitled to respect for their honor, family rights, religious practices, manners, and customs, and to be protected from an attack understood as any act of violence against themselves. They must be treated humanely, even in detention, because they can be interned, for instance, for security reasons. But again, even in detention or internment, they need to be treated humanely without any forms of torture, discrimination, or other degrading or inhumane treatment. There's special protection granted to wounded, sick, elderly, children below the age of 15, women, expectant mothers, and mothers of children below the age of 15. Occupying powers are obliged to ensure food and medical supplies being provided to civilian populace. The 4th Geneva Convention also enables the exchange of family and personal news, as well as reunification of families dispersed by the armed conflict. Now, the 4 Geneva Conventions are supplemented by 3 additional protocols dated 1977. The two additional protocols dated 1977 and the third additional protocol dated 1983. But the two additional protocols dated 1977 are a result of the post-colonial conflicts which occurred mainly in Africa in late 1960s and early 1970s. So as you can see, the international humanitarian law evolution follows the main or the major conflicts which have taken place before the adoption of those major treaties. So additional protocol 1 deals with the protection of victims of international armed conflicts, and the additional protocol 2 deals with the protection of victims of non-international armed conflicts. Now, even though these two additional protocols are additional to the 4 Geneva Conventions, they are in fact more in kin with the Hague branch of international humanitarian law, so regulating the code of the conduct of warfare rather than protection of victims. But nevertheless, they have been adopted under the auspices of the 4 Geneva Conventions. So I would go briefly and quickly through the provisions of additional protocol 1, which deals with international armed conflicts. This is the more relevant protocol given the situation, the war in Ukraine nowadays. So parties to the conflict are obliged to distinguish between the civilian population and combatants. So the principle of distinction is reflected in additional protocol 1, as well as between civilian objects and military objectives, and should limit their operations only against military objectives, which would include combatants, but not include civilians who do not take a direct part in hostilities. But even attacks directed against military objectives are prohibited if they are expected to cause incidental effects on the civilian populations of an excessive nature. And this is the reflection of the principle of proportionality. So if the incidental losses of civilian lives or civilian property are excessive compared to anticipated military advantage, we would consider such an attack disproportionate and thus prohibited. But yet again, the principle of proportionality requires us to compare expected incidental losses, so what we envisage, against anticipated military advantage. So what it means in practice is that we are conducting this assessment prior to an attack, and the assessments which are conducted afterwards are not necessarily properly reflecting the principle of proportionality. When an attack is directed at a military objective and is not expected to have excessive effects on civilians or civilian objects, still the attacker or the attacking party is required to undertake all feasible precautionary measures to minimize those incidental losses, those incidental effects on civilians, civilian populace, and civilian objects. Civilian population as a whole may not be attacked. And this prohibition includes the attacks against which are solely meant to terrorize the civilian population. The prohibition of indiscriminate attacks includes attacks which are not directed at a specific military objective, which involve the use of weapons that cannot be directed against a specific military objective, or attacks which treat different military objectives in populated areas as a single military objective. So as an example, if we have numerous military vehicles dispersed across uninhabited and densely populated area, from the law of armed conflict perspective, we cannot consider the grouping of those military vehicles as a single target. We should consider each individual military vehicle amongst those civilian structures as a single target and conduct proportionality analysis, etc., for each of those vehicles individually. Additional Protocol 1 prohibits the use of the so-called human shields, be it voluntary or involuntary. And it does also prohibit the destruction of resources necessary for the survival of civilian populace. Now, putting aside the instruments of international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict, I would like to highlight that NATO has adopted a number of policies and other documents related to the protection of civilians. Some of them that go well beyond the minimum standards required under Geneva Convention 4 or additional protocols. During the Warsaw Summit in 2016, NATO adopted the policy for the protection of civilians, which is meant to achieve a coherent, consistent, and integrated approach to the protection of civilians in NATO and NATO-led operations. So not only when NATO is in charge entirely, but also when NATO is a major contributor, but not necessarily the sole contributor to an international or coalition operation. So NATO forces should adopt all efforts to avoid, minimize, and mitigate the negative effects that might arise from their operations on the civilian populations. But this is not to say that these are only passive measures. To the contrary, the protection of civilians policy adopted by NATO requires that civilians are protected from conflict-related physical violence or threats or physical violence by any means where possible, which of course requires the cooperation with the local authorities, population, and the civil society. But nevertheless, the key highlight here is that the NATO's policy on protection of civilians is not just passive in nature. There's three main pillars of NATO's protection of civilians policy, which is the mitigation of harm, facilitation access to basic needs, and contribution to safe and secure environment. So I would like to focus on the mitigate harm pillar, which requires not only that NATO forces refrain from any actions that may negatively affect the civilian populace, but also adopt active measures against those who perpetrate acts of violence against civilian populace. Now, I know this has been really quick and rough, but yet again, the time frame allowed for this event or assigned to this event did not allow for a more elaborated approach. I am very grateful for the opportunity to speak to you, and I'm open to answer any questions you might have now.
Thank you, Colonel Goździewicz. Now we're gonna have we're gonna have Christian Zeitz, who is director of Association for Viennese Academics, but he's also running from March, 30 kilometers from Vienna, a campus and refugee facilities for approximately 150. It had, of course, more before because it's fluent, refugees from Ukraine. And I have maybe two questions for Christian. First of all, could you give some modern, what you know from your access to the refugees, history or some points, what kind of rights of civilians are violated from what you experience from those refugees? And of course, in the framework of what Professor Osadczy said about the region between Poland, Austria, and Ukraine now, how do you see this? And of course, with Colonel Goździewicz, how do you see this future of after this war between Russia and Ukraine? How to secure this civil rights and humanitarians of civilians in this kind of conflict in the future? What we can do, and maybe then we can have some few short questions because we are over the time. But plus, Christian, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Please give me the opportunity to introduce myself a little bit more specifically with respect to that what I am doing now, and you referred to the activities what we are doing now with respect to the nursing and caring for the Ukraine refugees. I'm usually, and in the last years, I had been the scientific director of the Institute for Applied Political Economy in Vienna. So predominantly, I had to do with theoretical questions and with the application of theories in economic practice. I had been also a consultant for these things. And 13 months ago, I had to change my personal identity completely within some minutes or maybe within some hours because of the consequences of the involvement of my family into the situation in Ukraine. They come from Ukraine, and we had been confronted with the fact that within some hours, a lot of friends and members of the family came to Austria as refugees after the days of the 24th of February 2022. And first of all, we had to care for them in our own house, and they had been 10 and 20, and then we decided it's not possible to do it just privately, and we asked a friend who is owning a very large facility approximately 30 or 40 kilometers from Vienna in Lower Austria. It's something like a house for blind people in former days. It had been without any relevant function within the last 15 years. And it's very large. There are 23,000 square meters for using for different purposes. And then within a couple of days, we had been together with 30, 40, 50, 70, 80 other refugees. They came to us, and on the climax, we had more than 280 refugees. At the moment, there are approximately 150 or 155 refugees, predominantly, of course, families, women and their children. We have approximately 55 children of every age at the moment. And so I had to change my identity to a very practical work every day as responsible for medical questions, for psychological questions, for technical electrical installation questions with respect to the facility, for the necessity to improve the situation of the house, for energy questions, for organizational, bureaucratic, financial duties, and so on and so on. So, of course, I am together with them within the last 13 months, 24 hours, 7 days a week. And I know how they are thinking and how they are feeling. But first of all, when I started to be in contact with Ukraine That's nearly 12 years ago. I regularly came to the Ukraine maybe 6 or 7 times every year. So I introduced a lot of contacts between our institutes and also political contacts, not only on the regional level, but also on the national level. And what I want to say first is that I had, what I said, contact to a lot of persons, a lot of people, a lot of representatives of different levels of the society. And I can say the Banderas mythos didn't have any reality at this time within the last, in the years between maybe 2010 and 2014. Nobody spoke about this. Nobody mentioned one word about Bandera. And nobody, of course, identified with the horrible things the professor told us and with the tortures the Polish people had to suffer from with respect to the Bandera's agenda. Then in the year 2014, you know, the so-called Maidan revolution in Kiev took place. And as a consequence of the Maidan agenda and the transformation process the Ukraine had to face in the years after 2014, the name of Bandera suddenly came into everyday discussions, step by step. And if you speak now with representatives of different generations, Bandera took a specific role into the myth and into the storytelling, which is behind the way how the war at the moment is proceeded. In the years after 2014, the Banderas myth had been implemented also into the everyday life of schools and of universities. And I can tell you that's not a thing which came from the intrinsic forces of the society of Ukraine, but it came from outside of the country, from stakeholders and players which had obviously strategic and global interests of the territory of Ukraine. And what we have now is a mixture between some specific historic myth of the past of Ukraine mixed up with ideas of superiority, of being a part of a mighty international structure which could be play an international important part and global part all over the world. And if you have a look to the propaganda, television and broadcasting activities, they are part of the everyday TV shows, also in the field of advertisement, also in the field of education, also in the field of films which are given as a basement for, I feel, transforming the psychological situation of the children, especially of the young generation, which are the fundament of being ready to have the propaganda basement of running the war like it is at the present. So I think it has something to do with some very specific feelings of the Ukraine population after the breakdown of the Soviet Union. The Ukraine had, as you know, a very, very bad economic constellation. There is no time to speak about this in details, but many of the men who had been into the working process lost their identity because they lost their work, and therefore maybe they had been able and ready to adapt old myths in order to substitute the perspectives of their real life to a very specific, aggressive, underlined agenda of the present. It's horrible to see, like, the ability of international storytellers is very close, linked together to this old Bandera myth. And this is one of the facts that some members of the population of Ukraine got within the last months more and more distance to reality and also to the reality of the constellation of this war. Especially the children are involved in this, I would say, psychological transformation process, and that's, I think, is a tragedy. So they are suffering from a strong international pressure to proceed this pseudo superiority of their artificial identity in order to facilitate it as a strong weapon against the military enemy. I think it's necessary, and it's a very necessary task to try to work together with the positive forces, not only in the Ukraine, but also on the international level, and to bring especially the young people back to reality, back to the factical perspectives they will have after the war. I don't want to use the time at the moment in order to give some predictions regarding the expected result of this war. But one time this war will stop, and it's very, very important to speak about the opportunities of coming to cultural and international normality. And I think that due to the historic basement of the situation in Europe, Poland, the Ukraine, and I'm of course speaking for the Austrian situation and therefore also Austria, are predetermined to establish alliances against the bad shadows of the past, to start now to speak about a common future in this region and to re-establish the vitality of the basements of this region. And I am sure that a very strong part of the fundaments in this region is the Christian culture, which should be re-established and should be reinforced in order to build bridges between the people who had been involved in a very, very tragical constellations within the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. I think we're gonna wrap it up because we are like I think it's over the time. But to generalize what we heard from Professor Osadczy the history what was happening 8 years ago. But the history, if we not take experience from the history, it's of course repeating itself in different constellations, in the different actors. But it's repeating. We heard, of course, Wiesław Goździewicz, the legal framework, what was happening, what from this time was set in the legal framework to secure those atrocities from the Second World War and those genocide like Holocaust, the Volhynian Massacre in Eastern and Lesser Poland, and others. How we of course, after this war that we have now with Russia, Ukraine, and we know a lot of violations, and of course on the OSCE we have a lot of statements from the Ukrainian side, from the Ukrainian NGOs showing the evidence of those violations. Of course, those violations, we must say that shouldn't be only in a political agenda, that we say that it's only one side that is the victim. Because we know from United Nations reports, we know from OSCE reports with all other international organizations that also there are victims from the other side, from the separatist side, pro-Russian side. We know that, of course, those numbers are different because the civilians in this war is like 1/3 from Ukraine and from the separatistic and Russian side. But we shouldn't. I think what we must do is not to politicize those security of civilians. We shouldn't use it as a political tool with diplomatic pressure on international organizations. And because then we, like Professor Osadczy is saying, those victims, civilian victims that were killed or injured, are harmed twice, because then their death and their casualty is politicized. It's like creating a ideological weapon if we are using. And in OSCE, what we can see that there is this bias. There is this bias, of course, because we cannot say, of course, that Russia violated integrity of Ukraine and so on, but in this regards, the international humanitarian law and human rights law regarding armed conflicts, it's universal and for other sides. And like Christian Zeitz said, this war is gonna end sooner or later. Hopefully, it's gonna end sooner, from the perspective, of course, of the victims. And that's why also we shouldn't have a blind eyes what is also happening in Ukraine. So the new Bandera movement, which we show you what was it 8 years ago. And now we have a cleaning of history in Ukraine, and showing that Bandera movement was the only insurgent movement fighting Soviets and so on. But there is cleaning that this was a totalitarian ideology, and this was committing genocide, pre-genocide, political genocide. So I'm gonna give the last word for Professor Osadczy, and we're gonna finish. Professor, if you can, if you have a last statement or some that you want to say, please do so.
Oh, thank you. I show historical facts and some events from this terrible period of the genocide, and it's pictures of this terrible events 18 years ago, events which are forgotten, and events which we must remember. And this place, this occasion is a good moment for the remember about this problem. It's not only Polish problem, and it's not only Ukrainian problem. It's a whole problem of humanity, as a problem of the Holocaust. It's not only Jewish problem, but it's things all humanity. And genocide of Polish people in the old Polish Eastern Borderland, it's one of the pictures history of genocides. That's all.
Okay, so thank you all for being with us on this topic, and those who are watching. For us, of course, is for Poles is a very serious and problem that we are emotional about it. But of course, like the professor said, this is a kind of universal problem that we must take experience from the history, not to, like I said, to repeat itself. So, not further ado. Thank you all for all, and if you like, contact us, Pantarey Foundation. We're gonna show the details in the end. Thank you.